tonight isn't a WordPress versus Elementor debate. So the original topic for this I bandied around a few months ago was Elementor versus full site editing, but I kind of peered away from that because it's not really a fair contest. So it's not a complete comparison. It's also not a prediction session about what WordPress will look like in 5 years or something. What I want to do is talk about something much more practical. So as freelancers, we're now in a position where we have multiple ways to build websites, including AI nowadays. We can build using Elementor workflow, and many of us know that very well, and that's probably why you're here. We can start exploring Elementor 4's more design system focused approach. We can build using full site editing, or we can combine those different approaches. The challenge isn't really that any of these are necessarily bad. The challenge is deciding which one kind of makes sense for the project, the client, and the long-term support reality. So rather than comparing feature lists, I want to talk a little bit more about practical trade-offs that I've been seeing within those kind of 4 different areas. So I think we often frame this discussion incorrectly. Whenever people compare Elementor and full site editing, the conversation quickly turns to features. But this one's faster, which one's more kind of future-proof, which one has better performance, which one has more flexibility, that sort of stuff. But as freelancers, that's usually not the real question. The real question is usually what approach creates the fewest problems for me and the fewest problems for my client over the next 2-3 years. Because once the website launches, we're the people supporting it and they're the people using it. We're the people explaining it and we're the people inheriting the consequences of the decision we make today. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be evaluating everything through that kind of lens. If you've got any questions, by the way, you can drop them in the chat and I'll try and answer there and then, or I can cycle back at the end to see what's there. A few years ago, this conversation was much simpler, which editing stack should we use? Most freelancers were either a page builder, using a page builder, or they weren't. Today, I think there's at least 4 practical approaches that many of us are seeing. The first is what I call the traditional Elementor. So that's like, the version 3 that everyone's been using up until this point. Most Elementor users today are probably there. So we're talking widgets, templates, global styles, theme builder, that kind of workflow that we're all kind of familiar with. The second stack is Elementor version 4, editor version 4. So same platform, but noticeably different mindset. More classes, class-first based, more emphasis on reuse, more design systems, design tokens, less kind of page-by-page styling on the seat of your pants type stuff. The third is what I broadly call blocks or full site editing. So things like generate blocks, the full site editor, using patterns, that kind of native WordPress workflows. And finally, there's the hybrid approach. And this is becoming increasingly common. So maybe Elementor for marketing and sales pages, blocks for content, blocks for blog posts, maybe something like generate press or generate blocks or some other combination of that sort of thing. The important thing is none of these approaches are automatically right or wrong. The question is, when does each one kind of make sense? Talking about Elementor, where Elementor still wins in this approach, I think. This is a real client project I worked on, not specifically this page. But if we look at this page, there's lots of moving parts. There's a video, there's a spinning color wheel, there's product categorization, there's different visual treatments, custom layouts, reusable sections, marketing content mixed in with promotional information. Now, could I build this with full site editing? Probably. Could I build this with generate blocks? Probably. But the question I ask myself isn't whether it's possible. The question is how quickly I can build it, how confidently I can modify it in 6 months' time, how easily I can explain it to the next person who inherits the site, the client, or their tech person. So for this type of project, Elementor still gives me a huge amount of flexibility and speed to build, especially when the client wants something a bit unusual or a bit animated or something that kind of goes out of that boundary of your WordPress full site editor or block type thing without having to build custom blocks. Right, so let's be honest, clients really ask for the standard layout anymore. They've always got some creative ideas that they want to put down on the web canvas. So the more unique the layout becomes, the more likely I'm still going to reach for Elementor to build that. It's more flexible for me, being able to replicate these more what I call complex layouts. The interesting thing is that Elementor 4 isn't really trying to change this advantage. It's trying to change how we manage projects like this, but more over time. So it's taking a longer term approach. We can still do the same thing, but the idea with the version 4 editor is it's trying to make things easier for us as freelancers. But we'll look at that just now. So when Elementor 4 was announced, a lot of the discussion focused again on features. People love to jump on features when there's a new version, a new shiny object in the room. So there was talk of atomic widgets, classes, CSS-first styling. But I think the bigger change is actually a mindset change. So historically, many Elementor sites have been built page by page. And what I mean by that is if you need a button, you add one and you style it. If you need a heading, you drag one in and you style the heading. If you need another page, you just duplicate the page and modify what's there. Elementor 4 is encouraging a different way of thinking. Instead of styling individual elements, you're defining a reusable system. Instead of creating a page, you're assembling components that have already been defined. And instead of creating 20 buttons, you're just changing the buttons styling system. Same button, but just different style. That's potentially a very powerful shift, and I'm all for that. But it's also a different way of working. Elementor 4 isn't primarily about building pages faster. It's about managing the larger websites more effectively over time. So I think everyone here has probably been asked to change a button color somewhere or a font size on a page or, a button over 20 different pages. And, what we tend to do is go into each page, modify all those styles. If we're clever, we'll create a style. But Elementor 4 is kind of not forcing us, but it's there to say, look, just do this thing once and then apply the change over the entire site. So the challenge isn't really which approach is better. The challenge is that freelancers think in systems and clients don't. Clients are still in that kind of page by page, element by element update stuff. So when I first looked at Elementor 4, my immediate reaction was, this is going to help me build more maintainable websites. And I still think that's true. But then I started to think about what happens at handover. Because clients don't usually think about components. They don't think about reusing stuff 2-3 months' time. They certainly don't think about design systems. They think about today's task. They want to update an image, change a button, add a section, container, publish a page. That's it. And that's where I think one of the interesting challenges of the Elementor 4 stack kind of appears. So as freelancers, we're being encouraged to build more structured systems, and that's a good thing, I think. But clients are still interacting with the site one page, one widget at a time. So it doesn't mean that Elementor 4 is wrong as a design stack for us. It just means that we need to think more about training, permissions, governance, and how much control we actually want the clients to have. A better design system doesn't eliminate governance over the website. We've all had that client who changes the color of one button because they only need that one button to change. And then 6 months later, there are now 14 different button styles across the website. So Elementor 4 can help solve that problem, but only if the people editing the site understand this new system. And that's really important, but it's also a burden on us because we have to train them and we have to get them from the client thinking, which is the stuff on the right-hand side there, make buttons bigger, change its color, add another section, over to now freelance thinking, which is what do all the buttons look like? Create reusable components, define spacing rules equally across the entire site. Clients don't get that at the moment. At least that's not what I'm finding out at the moment. They're still thinking about that page, that stuff on the page. So, while we can use Elementor 4 as a good design stack, a good editing stack, for us as a freelancer, we still have to think about the handover and what is that website going to look like in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months time, if we have to come back to it or somebody else to come back to it, are they still going to be applying design styles, or are you going to find 20 different pages with 14 different button styles? Because again, they've just went to local stuff and changed one button. So it's a real question. I like the stack and it makes sense for us as freelancers, but the challenge is that handover and how do we train clients, how do we get clients to embrace that particular design stack. Onto full site editing. I think the conversation around full site editing has changed quite a bit. A few years ago, people were asking, can it replace Elementor? And honestly, I think that was the wrong question. The question I'm asking today is it the right tool for this particular project? Because if I'm building a content-heavy website, a membership website, an association website, maybe a documentation portal or a resource library, I'm no longer automatically reaching just for Elementor. At least I'm considering a block-based approach. Not because Elementor is worse, and not because full site editing has improved significantly, but things like patterns are better, templates are better, global styles are better, pattern locking is a thing. The editing experience is more consistent now in full site editing than it used to be. And for some projects, that's probably enough to shift me over away from Elementor to consider a more full site editing approach for that. So 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have considered full site editing a client project at all. But today, I think I'm at the stage where I wouldn't automatically dismiss it. So I'm thinking more about what the project is, what it involves, what the client needs to happen, not just now, but over the next 6 months for those, and what their technical ability is, who's going to be editing that content. If it's highly technical users, that's one thing. If it's just content editors, you have to be a bit careful, because if you give them free reign, which Elementor does, you're going to get nasty results some of the times, because giving everyone everything all the time it usually results in a bit of a mess. But with the new FSC block controls, being able to lock a block pattern, then unlock certain things in there. For example, a CTA, you might lock that particular pattern so they can't move things around, but you have the ability to allow people to edit the header, change the button text and color, and change the image. But the whole pattern itself kind of stays the same. That's attractive to me when I'm thinking about building those types of client websites that need that consistency, so that it doesn't break the page when someone is editing it. So in those situations, now I would be considering full site editing in a block-based approach rather than maybe just Elementor. So the problem is that once we stop talking about features, another issue appears. Every editing stack comes with a cost. So when comparing editing stacks, we usually talk about features again, performance, widgets, flexbox grid, atomic components, patterns. But in my experience, that's not where the cost is. The real cost usually appears after launch. So every editing stack creates what I call cognitive load. So someone has to understand it, and that equates to how much do clients need to learn. So if it's a mile away from where they're normally editing, if you're doing a website redesign, and they're used to drag and drop stuff if they've been building with Elementor, and then you kind of smack them with a full site editing approach, that could be too much. You're the one that's training them up. You're the one that's got to, make sure they can take this thing and run with it. So how much do clients need to learn is a real thing. Someone has to document it as well. So how much of this new stack that you're using do you need to explain? So Elementor version 3, probably not very much because it's been out there for a few years, people are used to it. But trying to explain CSS first approach and telling them they shouldn't be going into a page and a button and just changing it to purple, that's up to you. We're the one that's documenting the system. So how much do you need to explain? Someone has to train people on it as well. So that's a combination of the first two. You've got to understand it, you've got to document it, and then we've got to apply the training. So, how many questions do you receive? How much training sessions are you willing to hold? An hour, 2 hours, a half day, a week. If the systems are that much away from where users are using it, that creates a real kind of mental cognitive load for the clients. And then the support, support questions. Again, are you going to start getting things back? How do I add this? How do I change this image? How do I change this header here? Then you've got to think about that. And eventually the client needs to be able to run with the system as well. So it really comes down to how easy is this to launch, hand over, and maintain over time. Because most freelancers, they just go with the build cost. So you do a project, client says how much, you go, this is how much I reckon. You build it, they pay you, job done. But then there's the training, support, and maintenance cost over time, which freelancers rarely think about. And it really is part of this stack that you're choosing to go with these website builds. So the best editing stack isn't necessarily the most powerful one. It's the one that you can hand over to your client, the client understands, and you can operate it ongoing for maybe 2 or 3 years with minimal friction. Which brings us to what I think is the most interesting trends right now is hybrid builds. So I think hybrid builds are becoming increasingly common. And honestly, some of them are really, really good. So for example, we have Elementor for landing and sales pages. We've got things like generate blocks for content pages and structure, and then WordPress patterns for reusable content. Now that can work really well, but the key word is intentional. The problems really start when a hybrid stack evolves accidentally. So maybe the suite starts out with Elementor, then someone adds generate blocks, then another freelancer installs some sort of block collection plugin, then someone adds some custom CSS, someone changes the underlying theme, that sort of stuff. When you've got a hybrid build that's constantly moving and people are adding to it, that's not good. Now you've got 4 different ways to achieve the same result. And that's not flexibility, that's just pure confusion. I'm sure you've clicked on an edit page and then spent 30 seconds, or you've been in the editor, the edit view, page view, and you're trying to remember, should you click on the page name and bring up WordPress block editor? Should you click on edit with Elementor? Should you go to the theme options to change that particular thing? Are you in the customizer, moving things around? Is it a custom CSS or something? Where do I go to change that particular thing? And when you get to that stage, you don't exactly know where you're going. That's a messy hybrid build. And it's important to realize that these hybrid builds can get, really messy really quickly, especially when you hand over to the client. They've got admin privileges and they just go completely nuts because they don't understand the way that you built it and how to maintain that ongoing. And ultimately, this is why I think the most important question isn't Elementor versus full-site editing. It's what happens when real clients get access to your website build. So when we discuss editing stacks, we often talk about the features and technology, but the clients don't interact really with that technology. They interact with workflows. How do they do stuff? How do they add this? How do they duplicate this? How do they get this thing to work? I've never had a client call me and say, Will, I've accidentally broken the atomic component architecture. But I've absolutely had people call me and say, the menu's disappeared, the home page looks weird, the buttons are wrong color, the form stopped working, the headers changed, that sort of thing. And that issue is really the technology itself. The issue is usually the editing workflow wasn't clear, it wasn't documented, it wasn't protected, or wasn't understood very well. So clients need different levels of protection. Some clients want complete control, and that's fine. That is their website. So again, you need to think, can your editing stack cope with that? Other clients should never see the design settings at all, because you just know it's a game of Jenga, and once you give them access to it, things are going to break. Permissions matter as well. So editors, authors, site managers, shop managers, marketing teams, not everyone should have access to everything. And technology doesn't remove this governance. Elementor 4 doesn't remove the need for governance. Full site editing doesn't remove the need for governance as well. They still need the website to act, as it's meant to. So better tools don't automatically create better decisions. The safest editing stack isn't the one with the most features. It's the one that matches the capability of the people using it. And that's a very kind of freelancer focused decision in which web stack that you're using. It's really is the choice that you make. Is you're really thinking about who's going to be editing it, who's going to be using it, what that's going to mean, and how the website is going to turn out. Permissions are an interesting thing in that I mentioned the full site editing now with the blocks. You can now lock block patterns and do really cool things with them. And in certain cases and certain clients, that would probably push me over the edge, just that thing alone. Being able to lock down particular block patterns and allowing them just to change the text, change the color, or swap out an image, which Elementor doesn't have at the moment, even with the new version 4. It's still pretty much a blank canvas. Yes, you can allow people to edit with Elementor based on their role, but once they're in there, they can do pretty much anything they want. So again, that kind of control as to what they can edit, what they can do. I'm thinking about that with my editing stack just now. And do I need that? Does the client need that in this particular web design? So after all this, where have I landed? What's my practical take for just now for 2026? I'll finish with where I've landed personally. So these aren't predictions, they're not recommendations, they're simply rules of thumb that I'm currently using. So rule number 1 is use the simplest stack that solves the problem. So I'm much less interested now in the coolest stack than I maybe was 5 years ago. I'm more interested in the design stack that creates fewer support headaches for me. So if I see a non-technical client, or if they're hiring staffers to come in and edit stuff, I don't want to give them full control of everything now. I'm hesitant to give them Elementor access because I know what's going to happen is I'm going to get a whole shit ton of support tickets to say this thing's changed, that thing's moved, how do I do this, so I'm more hesitant with that. So the simplest stack for that particular website project. Rule number 2 is the more unique the system is, the more likely I am to use Elementor. So if the project requires highly customized layouts, marketing pages, sales pages, campaign pages, a lot of visual flexibility, Elementor still is usually my first choice. Just that flexibility that I get from that, being able to animate things and move things and have good layout without the pain of having to do a buttload of CSS, which is still required if you're doing an full site editing one. Elementor would be my project choice, my stack choice. So think of that example I shown before with all the different layouts and things moving from before. Rule number 3, the more content focused the site is, the more likely I am to use blocks or full site editing. So this is kind of the opposite of rule 2. If it's not visually complicated anymore, so things like documentation, resource libraries, association websites, which are usually very content heavy. Today, I'd probably consider using some sort of block-based system, like generate press, generate blocks. With that, and the full site editing for headers and footers and template things. Rule number 4, hybrid works best when editing responsibilities are obvious. So if I can't explain where content should be edited in 30 seconds, I'd probably create a support problem for myself. But hybrid does work, but you've got that catch, is that, people start adding extra things on. That system you've designed just bloats, and it can be a bit of a monster. One of the client websites that I had as a hybrid, it was generate blocks, generate press, generate blocks. They had problems with some widgets weren't looking right. So when I went in, I'd found that they'd added 3 or 4 different plugins, groups of blocks, and now they had like 3 different heading blocks to choose from. And of course, I had styled the generate press one, and they were using one from another plugin, which just looked weird, because they're using the wrong type. So that can happen with hybrid design stacks. Lastly, rule number 5, choose the client you'll have in 2 to 3 years, not the one that you have today. So it might be you might think your stack is good just now, but what's it going to be like when you hand over in 6 months' time, 2 years' time, especially if you're the one with a maintenance contract or support contract and looking after the website. So just have a think, project yourself forward. What's the client going to be using this website for? What stuff are they updating? Will that stack still hold up with, in 1, 2, 3 years' time? So here are the questions I now ask myself when considering a stack for a website project. How unique does this design need to be? Who's editing this site? Who are the content editors? Who are the layout editors? How much training do they realistically need to absorb to run with this project without generating a ton of support for me? How many people will maintain this website over the next 2 or 3 years? I've had several clients who go through different councils or boards within a specific range, so maybe every year, maybe every couple of years. And it's a whole different stack of people using the same website. So, you need to think about, is your stack flexible enough to absorb completely new people who might be completely foreign to this stack? And does a hybrid approach simplify things or complicate them? Again, you've got to think about that risk, about that bloat. Can you constrain that? Do you know that the client will just not add any plugins, or you've restricted them and they just keep moving forward? Or are they free to kind of change things and create complexity to the website, which you then need to step in and support? Okay, that's it for tonight. I got some Q&A and discussion prompts. I'll pop them into the chat. There we go. And I'll come off my share.